When the actions in the cockpit are put together with the voice recordings, a timeline emerges that indicates a series of initially bewildering decisions.
I'll be back to you.
The timeline reveals that after Captain El Habashi leaves the cockpit, there's a series of sounds whose meaning can only be guessed at.
Excuse me, Jimmy, while I take a quick trip to the toilet.
Go ahead, please.
Before it gets crowded, while they're still eating, I'll be back to you.
Egypt Air's Flight 990 appears to be cruising smoothly over the Atlantic.
Speak of the devil, eh?
But then, the plane dips, plunging down.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. The aircraft you are looking at on screen is a photograph of the very aircraft that crashed into the sea on October 31st, 1999, in very mysterious circumstances. It did appear to have broken apart in mid-air prior to slamming into the sea. So how do we explain that? Now, if you only knew that and nothing else, it would be logical to assume that it exploded in midair because a missile struck it, right? On November 4th, 1999, new information emerged based on radar tracking. Obviously, this was a peek through just one lens, one perspective of the incident, but it was a perspective all the same. According to the BBC, the NTSB said analysis of radar data showed the Egypt Air aircraft plummeted almost in a straight line from 33,000 feet to 16,700 feet in about 40 seconds. Now, all of this is a matter of interpretation. What made the aircraft plummet? Well, following its initial descent, the aircraft climbed back to 24,000 feet. It then entered another rapid descent. That's according to NTSB's radar expert John Clark. Now, in colloquial terms, the craft dived, climbed back up, then plunged down again. So let me ask you a simple question. If an aircraft was struck by a missile, would you expect it to go down, then recover, fly upward, and then fly down again? According to the BBC, the Air Force tells us they see multiple primaries, that means radar targets, at 10,000 feet, said Mr. Clark. This suggests the jet could have broken up before hitting the Atlantic Ocean. Now, what's missing from that statement? It's not that the Air Force tells us we tracked a missile, some kind of bogey, approaching the craft. At that altitude, the aircraft had reached a point not consistent with flying an airplane, according to Mr. Clark. That is a euphemism for a plane is passing its threshold velocity. In other words, the speed at which the plane isn't really designed to withstand the forces around it. Clark did not speculate what this new information would mean to investigators, but when asked if the radar data was consistent with a plane breaking into pieces in flight, he said it could be. Well, that is exactly what it turned out to be. A plane breaking into pieces, is that consistent with a missile strike? What do you think? Now, it's easy to speculate about what happened more than 25 years ago in this particular case. Why? Because we've got so much information. We even have the events dramatized in not one but several documentaries. The critical question to ask is how much evidence is there of a missile? In other words, did the radar pick up debris, but it didn't pick up anything approaching or hitting the aircraft? And the pilots mentioned nothing of a similar nature either. Bear in mind, the pilots were present and alive and able to talk, and they were recorded in the cockpit voice recorder for quite a long time while they were struggling with the plane. Did they mention anything about a missile? What we do know in detail is some irregular behavior, both verbal and non-verbal, from the pilots involving peculiar protocols and peculiar relationships and strange behavior and some kind of falling out that one pilot has with another. How relevant is this? We also know something very unusual happened just before everything went to hell. There was a pilot alone in the cockpit, and of all the pilots on board, this was the pilot that had a record of strange behavior, and if anything, he also stood out as being the oldest pilot of the quartet. And besides all this, this pilot made some very unpilot-like comments before taking over the pilot seat, and also while he was piloting the craft through this catastrophic period.
I rely on God.
Whatever the first officer is intending, he says nothing except this phrase again and again. Captain El Habashi fights the disorientation of zero gravity, desperately trying to return to the cockpit.
Now, you might say, anyone in that situation might say that, I'm relying on God, I need God in the situation. But I think what's also interesting is when the captain joins his co-pilot in that situation, he doesn't say those words. And I think what's interesting is that this co-pilot only says those words, and he doesn't seem to try to apply for help from air traffic control. And so a question arises, is he trying to save the craft in the struggle, or is something else going on? And the same question can apply to the captain that's in the other seat. What is he trying to do? Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you're finding this coverage worthwhile, please do subscribe. You can also hit the notification bell. Bear in mind, those who are following the Koberger case, which is also in a way about a mass murder, it's 4 people were killed in one instance. He has just been sentenced, and we'll be looking at the 10 most shocking things from that sentencing hearing. So if you're interested in that, look out for that in the next couple of hours. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So what I think is very intertextual, which is another way of saying kind of an analogy to what we saw with Air India, is you have the captain saying, what happened? What's going on? And why is the captain saying that? Because somebody else did something that he wasn't aware of, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. And he would know what was going on if it was something that made sense given the normal flight operations, and this totally doesn't make any sense. And so is there a response to that? What happened? I did this, I did that, something happened. Well, the response is just, I rely on God, I rely on God. And so if the plane had been hit by a missile and the captain was in or near the area where this happened, one would imagine he'd be more aware even than the pilot of what had happened. He wouldn't need to ask anything. Does that make sense? So why is he asking something? Because something inexplicable has happened. And in the same way that the one pilot in Air India said, why did you turn off the switches? Words to that effect. This captain says, why did you shut off the engines? Exactly the same thing appeared to have happened. In other words, if you want to sabotage a flight, one of the best ways to do that is to turn these fuel switches off, which I think is something we need to know, because if you need to make things safer, maybe there needs to be more guardrails, more some kind of fail-safe around these safety switches. It seems to be a weakness in terms of this whole equation, doesn't it?
Then he tries to use the engines to power their way out of the dive by pushing forward on the throttles. But he gets nothing.
What? You shut off the engines?
Rely on God.
Desperate, the captain deploys the speed brakes, panels standing up from the wings, in an effort to slow the dive.
So what's really interesting in this situation is you're seeing one pilot doing something that appears to be trying to rescue the craft. What is the other one doing except muttering the same words? Now, I remember when I watched this documentary, I sort of noticed that the one pilot seems to be pulling on that thrust lever and the other one seems to be pushing on it. And in other words, they seem to be at cross purposes. The one is doing one thing and the other is doing something else. And that turns out to be an accurate depiction of what is really going on, because at a certain point the pilot says, pull with me, and the co-pilot doesn't. And that, I think, is already telling you that there's intentionality there, that one pilot is trying to save the craft and the other doesn't want to, intentionally doesn't want to.
The relief first officer, who would have been expected to come to the cockpit somewhere during the later part of the flight, halfway or wherever he was comfortable, wherever the normal change would have been, he came into the cockpit about 20 minutes after takeoff.
And this was unusual.
Kamal El Batouti used to be an Egyptian Air Force flight instructor. He is now one of the oldest first officers at Egypt Air. He is so much older than the other co-pilots that out of respect they call him Captain.
So that was his nickname, and we know there's a nickname for Sabarwal as well. Now, in this dramatization where you see this older pilot sort of being very familiar and having his hand, I think, on the, is it an air hostess, that is also not just there by accident. That is a accurate depiction trying to show one aspect to this particular individual.
But some at Egypt Air think that Captain El Batouti has been coasting too long on the favors of old friends. Just over 20 minutes after takeoff, El Batouti is about to leave his seat.
Now I'm going to take you through what happened during the first dive and recovery. But what we really want to know is, why did this happen? Why is this happening? And also, what is going on in this particular individual's mind? And one of the answers to that, which we'll address a little bit later, is some kind of disagreement that this particular individual had with another individual. And then I think the question arises, and it's something that you can ask in a rhetorical way, is this something that would really make a person feel any way in particular? Would an intention arise out of that? And anyway, now let's deal with the first dive and recovery. At 1:49:53, the throttles of both engines were moved to idle. Now, at this point, the aircraft it's being run by the autopilot, and it's this long period where the plane is flying overnight over the ocean. There's nothing needed. There are no course corrections needed. The autopilot can take care of everything. So during this period when this other pilot comes in to take over, and it's not even necessary, there's even a little bit of an altercation in a sense, a little bit of an argument, because the pilot that is relieving is saying, I've slept enough, you don't really need to relieve me. But he insists, and then shortly after that, it's taken off autopilot, which doesn't make any sense in that situation. And then it's immediately after that, and that's a decision he makes, that everything goes wrong, that the plane starts diving. And then, so a second after the engines are moved to idle, the aircraft enters an increasingly steep dive, resulting in weightlessness. And then despite this, the captain, who's kind of in the cabin, this all happens when the co-pilot is alone in the cockpit. The captain struggles against the lack of gravity to re-enter the cockpit. The speed of the 767 was now dangerously close to the sound barrier, exceeding the design limits and beginning to weaken its airframe. And so what does this tell you? Did the plane explode because something hit it, or did it literally break apart because it was being driven? It's not only going downward, it's not only the force of gravity that's pulling it downward, but it's actually accelerating with the force of gravity faster than its design limits. And so at 1:15 and 19 seconds, it's basically 30 seconds later, the flight reached its maximum rate of descent, which is 12,000 meters per minute. In other words, 12,000 kilometers per minute. And unless my math is wrong, that's 720,000 kilometers per hour. And obviously it's not going to be able to travel that distance in an hour. But think about it, 12,000 kilometers per minute. I don't think you need to be an aviation expert to imagine that at that speed, the plane is going to just break apart. So the captain pushed both throttles to their maximum position, but this had no effect because the engine's fuel supply had been cut off. So literally what happened was this plane dives and then the fuel supply is cut off. And so that's also something that happened with India Air, which means the captain's options for righting the craft are limited now.
Former National Transportation Safety Board investigator Greg Phillips became an expert on the events of this flight.
The relief first officer, who would have been expected to come to the cockpit somewhere during the later part of the flight, halfway or wherever he was comfortable, wherever the normal change would have been, he came into the cockpit about 20 minutes after takeoff.
I slept, I swear. Just wait, let me tell you something. I'm not going to sleep at all. I might come sit for 2 hours
But
and then...
I slept. I slept.
You mean...
So here you already have a strange situation where after just 20 minutes, this dude wants to sort of take over the flight, and then once he takes it over, something immediately happens. Can you see there's kind of a weird situation going on here, and it's really around one particular pilot?
You will get up, go and take some rest, and come back.
You should have told me this. You should have told me this, Captain Gamal. You should have said, Adele,
Did I even see you?
I will work first. Just leave me a message.
The younger first officer seems surprised that El Batouti wants to replace him so early in the flight.
Now, I'm not sure if you're picking up the other intertextuality. We're dealing with an older pilot, one of the oldest flight officers, and he's having an argument here with a much younger pilot who, understandably, finds his behavior inexplicable, but because he's older, he expects to be listened to.
I'm not sleepy. So you take your time sleeping, and when you wake up, whenever you wake up, you come back, Captain, okay?
I'll come either way.
Now, back on November 4th, before the flight data had been retrieved, so in terms of a sort of vacuum of information, one of the early theories was that there was a mechanical error, specifically that the thrust reversers engaged. This theory came about because of the bizarre fact that sometime during the descent, the plane was falling so fast, one of the engines literally tore off the wing. According to the BBC, officials said that the black boxes would also indicate whether one of the thrust reversers on the Boeing 767's engines had reactivated in midair, as it did on another Boeing 767 owned by Lauder Air, which crashed in Thailand in 1991. Now, what do you think the black boxes showed? Did it reactivate? On Wednesday, the hunt for clues was focusing on the role of the thrust reversers, one of which had been reported faulty on an earlier leg of the plane's journey and switched off before the New York to Cairo flight. And so what they're looking at here is, could it have been a mechanical error? And so literally what you need to look at are the patterns, the precursors. And in terms of that question, it is, are there mechanical errors? Is there a pattern of that going on? Right? Well, that's the one side of the story. The other side is there something going on in the psychology matrix? Is there something going on in terms of the dynamics between these pilots? And is there some kind of issue taking place there? And then one's got to look at whether there's a pattern there as well. Does that make sense? US officials investigating whether it could have reactivated in mid-flight have said they've had no evidence that such a malfunction caused the tragedy. So now you've got to take that, no evidence, against what you're actually hearing these pilots say from the voice recorders, and we're going to get to that in a second. So when additional data was retrieved, this theory fell completely by the wayside. There was no evidence supporting a mechanical failure. And so what became the vital instrument in terms of evidence? Well, the cockpit voice recorder. And this is where we come back into the true crime milieu in terms of this. Basically, what people are saying, what they're thinking, what their motives are, what their intentions are, what the evidence says in terms of that, in terms of their behavior. And so it recorded the captain excusing himself to go to the lavatory, followed 30 seconds later by the first officer saying in Egyptian, "I put my trust in God," literally almost instantly. As soon as the captain was out the way, suddenly there was this decision and this strange behavior. And then a minute later, the autopilot disengaged, immediately followed by the first officer again repeating the same Arabic phrase, which means, "I put my trust in God." 3 seconds later, the throttles for both engines were reduced to idle and both elevators were moved 3 degrees nose down. The first officer repeated, "I rely on God," 7 more times before the captain suddenly asked repeatedly, "What's happening? What's happening?" The captain also asked him, "What is this? What is this? Did you shut the engines?" The captain is then recorded as saying, "Get away in the engines." This is the literal translation, followed by, "Shut the engines." The first officer replies, "It's shut." And then the final recorded words are the captain repeatedly stating, "Pull with me, pull with me."
Warning signals indicate the dive is exceeding the maximum speed allowed for the plane, taking them to 99% of the speed of sound. This far past the plane's design limits, the stresses on the airframe are pulling it apart.
What's happening?
And just a few minutes earlier, before he took on that shift, the young officer was saying this.
Do you see how he does whatever he pleases?
Do you know why that is?
Captain El Habashi senses his first officer's resentment and tries to smooth over the situation.
Now you might say, could that resentment, that little altercation, could that lead to this horrible tragedy? And if you said no, well, you'd be right. The Mayday dramatization of the crash was based on ATC tapes as well as CVR recordings. According to Wikipedia, in interviews conducted for the program, the relief first officer's family members vehemently disputed this idea of that he would take his own life or a deliberate crash theory and dismissed them as biased. But the program, this is Mayday, nevertheless concluded that Albert Tutti crashed the plane for personal reasons, that he had been severely reprimanded by his supervisor for sexual harassment after allegedly exposing himself to teenage girls and propositioning hotel guests, and the supervisor was on board the plane when it was brought down. And so the question is, do you think he was upset and embarrassed and angry as the sort of elderly person about that? And how did he feel about this person, his supervisor, possibly telling his colleagues about this as well? And what was going to happen when he got back home to Egypt? Would he be able to keep his job? What do you think? So an interesting conclusion to this whole story, William Langewischer, an aviation journalist, said, in the case of the Egyptians, they were following a completely different line of thinking. It seemed to me that they knew very well that their man Battuti had done this, but they were pursuing a political agenda that was driven by the need to answer to their higher-ups in a very pyramidical, autocratic political structure. The word had been passed down from on high, probably from Mubarak himself, that there was no way that Battuti, the co-pilot, could have done this. For the accident investigators in Egypt, the game then became not pursuing the truth, but backing the official line. And so the question is, could something like this be happening in India?
Rely on God.
Whatever the first officer is intending, he says nothing except this phrase again and again.
Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.